Welcome to this episode of podcast being hosted by Alliance School of Liberal Arts, Alliance University, Bangalore. Today with us we have Professor Ankhi Mukherjee. Professor Mukherjee is a professor of English and World Literatures at University of Oxford and a fellow at Wadham College. Her most recent monograph, Unseen City, The Psychic Lives of the Urban Poor, published by Cambridge 2021, has won the Columbia University's Robert H. Liebert Award for, and I quote, outstanding scholarship in the field of applied psychoanalysis. Mukherjee's second monograph, What is a Classic? Postcolonial Rewriting, An Invention of the Canon by Stanford University Press of 2014, was also awarded the British Academy Prize in English Literature. Her other publications include Aesthetic Hysteria, Great Neurosis in Victorian Melodrama and Contemporary Fiction, published by Routledge in 2007. And the collection of essays she has edited, namely A Concise Companion to Psychoanalysis, Literature and Culture, with Laura Marcus, published by Wiley Blackwell in 2015, and After Lacan by Cambridge University Press in 2018. She has recently co-edited a collaborative volume titled Decolonizing the English Literary Curriculum, published by Cambridge University Press in 2023. Mukherjee has published in competitive peer-reviewed journals including PMLA, MLQ, Contemporary Literature, Parallax and Cambridge Journal of Postcolonial Literary Inquiry, and sits on the editorial boards of several international journals. She has been a postdoctoral research fellow of the British Academy from 2003 to 2006, a visiting fellow at the Humanities Research Centre at the Australian National University, Canberra in 2015, and the John Hinckley Professor at Johns Hopkins University in 2019. She was invited faculty at Harvard University's Institute for World Literature in summer 2023-24. At present, Mukherjee is completing two books, a very short introduction to postcolonial literature in the widely circulated VSI series of Oxford University Press, and Mavericks and Charlatans by Empire, Modernity and the Authorization of Dreams by Princeton University Press. Before I say welcome, that was too much work that you have done already. So now welcome Ankhi. I endearingly call her Ankhi. So why this transition from Victorian studies to world literature to psychoanalysis? So which is the real Ankhi?
Fantastic question. One I've been waiting for all my life. Thank you, Arindam. Thank you for the wonderful, fulsome introduction. Well, my life and research are not very church and state, and the different phases of research reflect the different phases of my life. My first interest, and I would say it's still sort of a very a predominant interest, is in Victorian literature and culture. And when I was writing my PhD, I kind of really gravitated toward what is now called the history of medicine, medical humanities, because I saw a lot of male hysteria in the melodramas, and some of them were unpublished, sort of like, meant to be staged, not read, nautical melodramas starting from the 1820s way down to the 1850s. And I was terribly interested in the kind of food chain between the performance of hysteria in these melodramas, the imbibing of this melodrama by the Dickens and the Eliots of the 19th century, and Freud's writing up of it, Freud and Charcot's writing up of psychoanalysis towards the end of the 19th century. So that's what aesthetic hysteria was about, that in a way we need to kind of look at the melodramatic imagination and culture. That term is a coinage of Peter Brookes, to understand psychoanalysis. Then when I came to Oxford, the job I got was actually was held by Robert Young, who's a renowned postcolonialist, and so on the one hand, I was teaching the classics of English literature. On the other, I was also sort of like keeping up with the work he had started in the field of postcolonial literature, namely running a seminar, teaching more postcolonial options.
Right.
And my second book, What is a Classic, it came out of that ferment, if you will, that what was I, I grew up in a small town in India doing, sort of transmitting this high canonical literature to the British, and the second book doesn't have a trace of hysteria or psychoanalysis, but it is actually, if you read between the lines, you see I'm constantly writing about almost a psychosomatic and a kind of compulsive repetition. Why do postcolonial authors feel the need to return to canonical texts? What are they doing? Why are they mutilating the things they love? So it is a very psychoanalytic reading without calling it by its name. While I was writing the second book, I was wondering myself why I wasn't researching on psychoanalysis anymore, the kind of very field I had sort of navigated for my PhD. And the answer was that I felt increasingly isolated and alienated, not in a personal way, but I felt that it had become very sort of bourgeois, very white, very privileged, and I didn't really understand what the relevance of this would be for the non-white, the non-elite, the non-English speaking person, etc. And around this time, I came across a body of writing, a small body of writing on the social democratic thinking of what was called Red Vienna. And I realized that actually Freud had sort of mandated that psychoanalysis be made free. And my third book, Unseen City, it kind of followed, I followed that Ariadne's thread to get out of this sort of labyrinth of confusion on psychoanalysis, and that it does have a very strong socialist imagination. It has tremendous relevance for the maladies of the poor. The methods of soul making that psychoanalysis allows or encourages are wonderful for the humanization of the oppressed and the disenfranchised. So in my mind, these are connected, they're sequential, and they keep, and then, my book, Mavericks and Charlatans, I'm again going back to my 19th century roots, because I'm looking at this kind of proto-psychoanalysis, thinking on dreams and dream interpretation and dream writing by authors like Coleridge and Dickens and De Quincey, well before Freud and Jung formalized that. Truck do post-colonial critics have with soul making? The psychoanalysis is a very secular soul making. So in a way, you could argue that the religious confession, there are Indian psychoanalysts who say that what Krishna says to Arjuna in the Battle of Kurukshetra is a form of psychoanalysis. So I don't think the idea is very alien to Eastern thinking either, and that there have been these sort of transferential circuits that have been there in the Guru Shishya tradition, or in kind of more lateral forms of conversation, the kind of dialogues and dialectics. So I don't think there is any problem with that. And one of the reasons that's very distinctive about psychoanalysis is that Freud insisted that there be this kind of dyadic movement, and kind of he acknowledged transference. In other words, he did not want psychoanalysis to become an anthropological science where a different kind of ethnographic soul making was taking place. Here, the analyst was as affected, as vulnerable to the exchange as was the analysand who had come for a cure. So I don't think that there is any sort of, in a way, conflict in the way we can think about soul making from a post-colonial vantage point.
So going back to the world literature, when we have seen moments of Goethe's concept of world literature, where the Western European texts had the power to penetrate the transnationality and even come to the global south. And we have seen the moments when the empire writes back. So now where? What do you see sitting in the queue, the best of the universities possible in this world and the best of the departments possible? Where do you, your colleagues, how do you navigate this, world literature now, today?
I mean, there's the kind of word salad around post-colonial or world literature or decolonial or decolonizing is such that we could all say we are all post-colonial.
Right.
That India is post-colonial, so is England. But it's not the same. The symmetry of power is different. The asymmetrical historical exchanges show that we are not post-colonial in the same way. Similarly, you could say that Shakespeare is world literature, but it's also not, in the sense that world literature is kind of like bringing together the world and literature, and it refers to this particular kind of literature that is both sort of like national, but also excursive. That's kind of bringing together the local and the global. Damrosch has a funny word, glocal, for world literature. There's an intentionality to world literature in that sense, and a lot of literature is unintentionally world literature. You could say Mahabharata and Ramayana, our epics are if you look at the continuities between the Greco-Roman kind of epic imagination or tragic imagination, our epic and tragic imagination, in that sense they're all world literature, in the sense that they're free to be disseminated across the world. But I mean, world literature refers to something that has not forsaken its kind of, in a way, language, cultural roots either. That it's not just made as a something that we can gobble up, in the international literary marketplace. So where do I see it? I mean, I do think that when we think about world literature, we can only do justice to the affordances of that concept if there is also sort of concomitant language learning. So one of my students was working on Sri Lankan kind of Tamil literature has gone and learned Tamil, because gone are the days when you can sort of like grandstand from Oxford and talk about Sri Lankan literature and Bangladeshi literature and Indian literature as if these are all sort of interchangeable ciphers, So I do think that this idea of why are we reading a particular very niche production of Tamil literature, because it speaks to certain kinds of insurgent cultural moments that have correspondences with other parts of the world. At the same time, it's very rooted in its own language and context. So I think with everything is world literature and not everything is. I do think that we need to kind of be very focused on context and history and cultural production and intertext, while also sort of in a way developing. Edward Said says that you can read Great Expectations as a novel about England, but it's also a novel about Australia, and it's about Australia's England and England's Australia. So in that sense, these are all works of world literature. So yes, we can deploy that expansive imagination, but not at the cost of forgetting to learn languages or trying to kind of get a very contextualized understanding of the literary artifact in question.
So this surely brings us to your next project, the Introduction to Postcolonial Theory. For a long time we did not have a very solid novelty focused introduction to postcolonial writing or postcolonial theory. So what new should we expect from Ankhi Mukherjee?
So it's a very short introduction, and that's very difficult to write, to kind of like really capture this vast and very influential body. You have so many Booker winners, Nobel winners, Pulitzer winners who respond to this category, postcolonial. Two key things. One is it's a very short introduction, so it's meant to be an introduction to somebody who's in school, as well as an introduction to somebody from a different field at university, or somebody from a different discipline who wants to know what is this all about. Secondly, to go back to this kind of the mess of terminology we have, that increasingly we use terms like decolonizing or decolonial where we mean postcolonial, because it's almost as if the promise of postcoloniality was baffled. We are not postcolonial. Some of the same ills, communalism, inequality, they are rife in the so-called postcolonial state. But postcolonial literature is a kind of very historic phenomenon which genuinely explored what it meant to kind of, in a way, outlive the aftermaths of colonialism. So what I'm trying to do is kind of really, instead of calling everything decolonial, give postcolonial literature its due. That much of decolonial thinking, much of decolonizing thinking actually stems from postcolonial writing. I mean, I really don't want my book to be some kind of have an elegiac mode. I mean, I want to say this is very much alive. Correct. The postcolonial imagination is very much alive and has to be alive, because, the architects of partition in the Middle East are the architects of partition in the subcontinent, and they are connected to colonialism, So it's those demons haven't ceased to haunt us. So it's very important to kind of understand what postcolonial literature is, what its relationship is with its more cosmopolitan cousin world literature, or with its sort of, in a way, more politically minded relative, that is what we call, kind of a decolonial modes of thinking, some of which also have almost a return to a kind of native language and have a return to ethno-nationalism, which post-colonial literature has very little to do about, because one of the most beautiful things about post-colonial literature is the invention of post-colonial English, post-colonial language. You know, think about what someone like Salman Rushdie or V.S. Naipaul or Chinua Achebe did to the English language, or, you know, even more recently Arundhati Roy, you know, what she did to the language. You know, these are, so I want the book to be sort of very historically aware of the contribution of this, what we call post-colonial literature, and the way it's been very generative of these additional terms.
So this brings me to a question which I never, essentially planned to ask you, but then we never had a short introduction to decolonial literature. We had a lot of series of introduction to post-colonial literature. So will Ankhi Mukherjee take this up as a new project?
Well, the thing about decolonial literature, I mean, if you are going by the Walter Mignolo, it really is very based on language. Right. So I can only talk about maybe decolonial literature in a South Asian or kind of like more closely the Indian subcontinent question. But yes, I mean, not to say these are widely different. I mean, post-colonial literature is correct. To be post-colonial is to be after. It is to be, is to have survived, to have kind of, in a way, it is ringing the death knell of colonialism. But that's the decolonial thinking kind of goes a step further and says that, actually, no, you cannot do this in the master's language with the master's toolkit. You need to invent a new toolkit. But sometimes, with kind of more right-wing, as we have seen, the tremendous sort of like kind of very fearful rise of the right wing, this has fallen into the wrong hands. Now, if
decolonial demon.
Also, like if you start looking for purity, where does it stop? Who is the original inhabitant of India? A lot of us would have to go home in that case, wherever home is. So I do think that there are limits to that, and it's good to see them as historical phenomena, and it's good to have a rebuttal to post-colonial in the form of decolonial thinking. But I also don't sort of, in a way, I do think that there are problematic aspects that we need to constantly engage with, namely that sort of the ethno-nationalist imagination of decolonial writing, definitely.
So for you, that's more of a primordialist stance?
To some extent, I don't think that exists. Right. I don't think that can exist. If you look at place names being changed in a hurry, I mean, it doesn't make any sense to me, because it's exactly this extreme hybridity and mixing that I think gives India, in particular, its remarkable strengths,
So, difficulties of decolonization in India?
I mean, decolonial and decolonizing are not exactly the same thing. I mean, post-colonial writing, post-colonial theory, it is decolonizing. It is sort of a kind in its own way, yes, but decolonial is a kind of a different circus animal altogether.
So let's come to your Mavericks and Charlatans. Your Mavericks and Charlatans. How do they take up this game?
Again, it's going back to Unseen City was a very experimental, interdisciplinary book that I wrote with some difficulty over 10 years. You could say this is kind of a palate cleanser before I write the sequel to Unseen City. And this is a very richly literary work. I taught a 13-week course at Johns Hopkins where I was visiting professor on, I called it Dreams, Thought Theory, Writing, Architecture. So I was looking at works beginning with Coleridge's Kubla Khan, Charles Kingsley's Alton Locke, Charles Dickens's, Italian Dream, Virginia Woolf, Rokeya Shakabat Hussain, Girindra Shekhar Bose, Salman. I mean, I had 13 weeks, so I had sort of free reign. And the thing that increasingly dawned on me was that so much of what we understand as dream interpretation in a psychoanalytic sense is dominated by Freud and Jung, and we don't quite understand the other theorists of the mind that, for instance, Abercrombie, for instance, or McNeish, that Dickens would have read and Coleridge would have read, So this is a book about how these dreamers, I call them sort of, the sleep-deprived and the dream-prone, how they imagined what dreaming would do to their writing. I mean, Dickens is kind of attempting a kind of almost automatic writing when he's writing in that dream mode. Coleridge is saying, my poem is a found object. I didn't write it, I found it. So what does it do to ideas of authorship? So it's a very richly literary book on what it might mean to kind of claim the oniric, which is in itself about a loss of control. We can't will our dreams. But they're also, like, I mean, if you look at the diaries, they're actually trying to will their dreams, or they're trying to kind of predict what their dreams will be. And I think the reason why it's extremely important, what connects my authors, is both this desire to sort of almost eschew control. But it's not everybody can write a Kubla Khan or a haunted house. I mean, you, even when you think you're writing automatically, it's a technique. It's a deeply, very sophisticated, very polished method of showing that I'm writing without authorial intention. What was it for these people, in post-industrial modernity that made them want to write like that? How does empire impinge on each and every one of them? The period I'm writing about is 1815 to 1950. And I'm looking, for instance, at two exact contemporaries, Virginia Woolf and Rokeya Shakhawat Hussain. What are their thoughts about, what kind of utopianism do they associate with the dream state? And they had similar contexts, you could say, vastly different, but also sort of, they're both kind of like, creatures of the empire. And they're both modern, kind of like really ushering both modernity and modernism in their writing. So, I mean, they're both feminists. So, I'm kind of looking at these correspondences, between non-adjacent authors when it comes to dream thinking, dream writing, what kind of mental architectures they are proposing. And of course, finally, the utopianism that comes. So one of my authors is Du Bois. There's a lot of dreaming in his fiction writing. What does a dream mean? What does it mean? What sort of emancipatory potential does dream have?
So do you see a Jungian connect in all these, right?
I mean, there will be lots of kind of references to, of course, Jung and also, Freud. I mean, Woolf, who disavowed Freud, will also publish Freud. So they'll be there. But I'm more interested really in very topical thinking on dreams. That, I mean, psychoanalysis is not this sort of eternal gospel truth, but, it's something that was produced in Central Europe, I mean, so I'm kind of like, to some extent, contextualizing classical psychoanalysis, but also saying that these were all the other thinking, including, Coleridge coined the word psychosomatic. So it's really looking at the ways in which these authors, they wanted to sort of, in a way, plumb the depths of their unknown mind.
So when your subtitle has something like empire in this, dreamers and charlatans, how do you position it? Do you see that this concept of anima mundi that Yeats would have said, right, in this concept of gyring and spirals and all? So is it something that is broken and reshaped from the perspective of the global south when we dream, when we create?
Are you saying that, I mean, of course, yes, Rokeya Shakhawat Hussain in her sort of,
or
like,
maybe perhaps people like Shakti Chattopadhyay, who inebriated when he writes,
yeah,
right? So are our dreams, our imageries, so as to say, are they something that disrupts the entire global West's anima mundi? Does it have the
I mean,
power
yes, I
to?
mean, that's precisely the case, for instance, with Girindra Shekhar Bose,
Yes.
when he's writing his Bengali book Shopno. He has sort of like, he's a so-called disciple of Freud, has a correspondence with Freud, but he's also sort of saying he has a different theory of,
Right.
he has a theory of opposite wishes, which is very different from the kind of interpretation of dreams you see in Freud's eponymous, this kind of really epochal book, Interpretation of Dreams. So yes, I mean, to some extent there is that conversation saying, no, sorry, that's not how it works in my bit of the world. But it's also sort of, I mean, I hesitate to say that the thinking is entirely independent of each other. I mean, when Charles Dickens is writing about Venice, he's thinking about the East, he's thinking about the Ottoman Empire, he's thinking about the Gothic. When Coleridge is writing Kubla Khan, he's not only thinking about the Mongolian autocrat, he's thinking about the entire genre of colonial travelogue. So they're not very far from each other. So I'm looking at these intertwined narratives which go behind their imagining of what dreaming might be.
Can I ask you? I mean, around the authenticity of these imaginations. When we talk about the Abyssinian Maid, or when we talk about Kubla Khan's palace, uh, the question of authenticity of the same might have been challenged as to, you know, who is the owner of the dream? Is the West the owner of the dream? Is East the owner of the dream? Is dream a kind of a connect that you're talking about, which it can be from psychoanalytic perspective? Were there ever issues in you as a writer or researcher where you felt, that there is a sense of control over these dreams that the West is trying to make and the East is trying to respond back, as Girinder Shekhar would have said, that it's my kind of a dream?
I mean, in a way, I'm not looking at other languages, I'm looking
Right.
at English literature.
Right.
But I am, when I'm, one of the things Coleridge says is that, this entire dream, there's a very funny Guardian article by Hilary Mantel. He says this person from Pollock comes and wakes him up, and Hilary Mantel says that's his drug dealer. So he gets his sort of consignment of opium,
And then it doesn't
and
complete that
and
intent.
then he loses the dream. He was dreaming till then. So
Correct.
person from Pollock is somebody who is actually a real sort of interruption to the dream. I mean, I'm much more interested in what happens to authorship when somebody is writing a dream narrative.
Right.
So I'm looking at selected, not all their writing is in this vein. But for instance, Charles Kingsley, who famously wrote Water Babies, his book Alton Locke, which is not even in print anymore. This is about the kind of really sort of brutal rag trade in the poorest parts of London. And Alton, he's somebody who wants to be an archaeologist, but he can't be because he's too poor to go to Cambridge or to have the sort of requisite training and professionalization. But he's given these lurid dreams where he travels, he dances with Kali, and he sort of jumps up to Himalayas, and he undergoes the travel that the archaeologist would in the modality of the dream. So there is something really interesting happening with the dream, and it's sort of like, in a way, threshold crossing of the everyday and the English and the modern, into something that is phantasmagoric, something that is non-English, and something that is pre-modern or post-modern.
Any other projects in the offing?
Well, I definitely want to kind of go back to. I mean, I had very fulfilling collaborations for Unseen City, that some of which I've sustained. So I'd like to go back and revive that project.
Because you have elsewhere said, because we had a talk, you delivered a talk on Unseen City today, where you said that it comes in, volumes, and you have a lot of research data still awaiting to be churned out into material. So
I'd like to kind of go back to,
Yeah.
I have a project in mind, I call it Equity of the Unconscious, and I definitely want to go back. And the difference between Unseen City and this is Unseen City was very literary as well. 3 of the chapters were on literature,
Right.
on Tejukol and Aminatafona, on non-fiction narrative coming from India, on the slums, or on poverty in India. But the next book, I think, will have a different kind of literary input, in the sense that, to some extent, here I was recording, in Unseen City, I was recording or transcribing the work that was happening elsewhere. But in the next project, I will be very much one of the actors, as in the collaboration will now take the place of and this has already started happening. I'm on the advisory board of NGOs, where I teach a psychoanalytic trainee how to read, or I kind of help them write, I help them navigate case studies. So there will be sort of a kind of a more organic involvement. I definitely also want to kind of have a project where I get people with quantitative skills, that I'm not always reliant on the data coming from the NGOs, but I can have somebody who can do that sort of, a longitudinal research, who's experienced in longitudinal research. I would like to have a collaborator with some social sciences methodologies that they can. I mean, for me, it was a rag bag of methods that I had to kind of learn painstakingly.
Right.
But life is short, So I'll do my thing, and I will get experts to do their thing as my support system. So yeah, I mean, that's something I definitely want to do. But I first need to finish the very short introduction. I'm taking a very long time to write it, and I want to finish my Mavericks and Charlatans, which I think will be it'll be a beautiful book to read, because I'm really enjoying. I'm trying to write it with less sort of like self-censorship than I do. You know, I mean, I'm so self-censoring that I can barely publish anything. So, I mean, I'm just trying to write it in a
So
more
does your
fluid way.
method also capture the dreaminess?
Of course, I mean, I'm a sort of incorrigible dreamer. I dream all the time, and I have very elaborate dreams. You know, not just like something that you forget the next day. So I definitely want to. I am interested in this because I have this sort of rather discombobulating dream life myself.
Towards the end, as we come, your advice to the people, the students aspiring to take up research in cultural studies or world literature, postcolonial studies, psychoanalysis. What should some piece of advice for them?
Well, I mean, as I said to the undergraduates this morning, I think for this field of work, reading is extremely important. Reading voraciously. You know, I mean, I read Jane Eyre in Bengali before I read Jane Eyre in English. And I'd gobble up anything that came my way. I was very young when Shei Shumai was being published in
Serialized
sequel
and
a serialized
Desh.
form in Desh, and I was very young. But I started reading, and my parents, who were otherwise quite conservative, said, you know, if she can read it, why not? So this was a habit that was fed. That, you know, I was not very academic. I was not very focused. I was, in fact, you could say, quite aimless as a child. You know, I knew what I liked, and I knew what I was good at, and I knew how quickly. So I mean, once you've found something like that, if English literature is that thing or any other, just read it. You know, this is the history, and the history of the literature matters almost as much as its present. You can't think about futurity without understanding that history, because those kinds of automatic thinking, robotic thinking, mechanical thinking, the kind of, you know, those forms of sort of, you know, in a way, metamorphoses are already imagined. The mechanical prosthesis is very much there in you know, it's, we don't need to kind of like suddenly say AI. That's very much, you know, that imagination is very much there. You have environmental thinking, you have sort of vegan thinking in Mary Shelley's Frankenstein. So I mean, I think that if you like literature, read it voraciously. Don't let go of language specialism. I think that's always an extremely useful thing. Don't be afraid of sort of like new frontiers like computation, AI. You know, if that appeals, you know, see how it can interact with your subject. And finally, I mean, I do think that a certain kind of interdisciplinary thinking is another way in which we hybridize our subject to make it stronger, you know, to make it survive. That, you know, what are the different conversations we can start with our skill set? I mean, that for me, I didn't do it with any intention of reviving the humanities. This was my bent of mind. But I do think that that always helps, you know, that kind of thinking that I'm willing to sort of experiment, you know, whether it is with literature and music, or literature and, you know, kind of the graphic arts, or with literature and AI, literature and climate. You know, I mean, I do think that these make for very interesting, sustainable, future-facing projects.
Thank you so much, Rakhi. I mean, this can continue and continue, but then, given the format of a podcast, we'll have to close this. But then, I believe that we can continue the next time when you come back, especially on sustainability, AI, things we haven't not touched, and we must. And then maybe by that time we'll have both your monographs published. Thank you so much. So, viewers, catch us on the next podcast and keep watching us with the podcast shows at Alliance School of Liberal Arts. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Thank you, Arindam.